Welcome, everyone.
We're on the right one today.
That's right. Yeah, please continue to message me if you were there that day. I have a list of those who were, so hopefully you're on that if you were there. And I apologize for that. I chose the wrong Zoom meeting to uh to join. I thought that was strange that I was by myself, and I should have trusted my gut and not have gone with it. All right, let's see here. One, two, three, four. Missing one more. Oh, okay. There's a double. All right, great, great, great. All right, how are you guys? You guys have any questions? No? All right. So we're doing the War for Independence, okay? We're getting along rather quickly in this class, having only 5 days to do everything instead of 7. So what we're looking at, please be sure it pertains to one of the numbers on your test to read the introduction. All right. What I believe to be uh, quasi universally relevant information, right? I say almost because, you're going to see that in this number. There, whatever beginning assumptions that you start with, right? They're going to largely dictate what information, what facts you find to employ in your history of the war for independence. So, for instance, right, court history. Court history contends, right? Remember, COURT, like a king or queen, you know, uh, asking a court scribe to write a history of his or her kingdom, right? That person is going to choose facts that have a very positive, that shed a positive light on that king or queen, right? So with court American history, what they contend is obviously you could guess that they're going to justify our rebellion against Great Britain, right, from 1775 to 1783. But they're also going to contend that we have an exceptional, a special country, right? That we stand out from the rest, that we're different in a better fashion, right? So normally, right, in human history, what might be deemed as unexceptional are power plays, right? Certain demographics, certain individuals just wanting power, just wanting resources, right? Looking out for their self-interest, for not only their own individually, but whatever their faction is. And remember, your faction is a group that you share the same economic self-interest with, and or the same ideology, beliefs. So, with court history, right, we're going to contend that we're a special country that was born on ideas, right? That that in particular, right, we're going to look at a few movements, but the Scottish liberal movement, the French Enlightenment, obviously, the Great Awakening religiously. Okay, those are kind of the primary intellectual movements that supposedly influenced our decision to fight and break free from Great Britain, right? And those ideas we're going to contend we live by, that we identify with, that make our country exceptional to this very day. All right, so that's court history. And if you want to put an historian, tie an historian to that name, I usually tie Bernard Bailyn, Bernard, and then Bailyn, Bernard Bailyn. He has a book called The Ideological Origins of the Revolution. And so, I mean, the title says a lot, right? That there were that the origin, the foundation of our independence is found in certain ideological facets to this time period, right? Certain ideas that were percolating at that time, and then revolution. Sometimes historians can be pretty stubbornly selective, right? Picky in using that term. To me, right, I abide by what I've read from a rather strict um, interpretation of the word revolution, right? Like in Spanish, when you dar una revolución, you give a 180-degree turn, right, to something. And then oftentimes some people will even go so far as to put it into the three categories that sociologists, that historians have borrowed from sociology. Was there a political 180-degree turn, right, for us to have a revolution? So politically, did the governmental system change fundamentally? Not just those who were in charge, right? Which demographics took over from whom, but what type of government system was set into play? Then economically, not only those who gained a bigger piece of the pie, so to speak, right, economically, but what type of economic system did we unravel? Did that constitute a 180-degree change? And then lastly, socially, what about our culture, our values, normative behavior taught to our kids? Did that fundamentally change as well? All right. Another court historian who sometimes will make an argument for that, for us having a bona fide revolution, would be Gordon S. Wood. This is more factual based, his American Revolution, but he has another book called the pretty much like the radical nature or the radicalism of the revolution, by this same author, Gordon S. Wood. All right. And so, people will agree oftentimes on the French Revolution, on the Bolshevik Russian Revolution of 1917. But American Revolution, it's more contested as far as us having a revolution or not. That's why I play it safe in my term for this exercise and this topic, and I just more safely call it the War for Independence. All right. So with the idea of it being a revolution, like I said, you have Bernard Bailyn, and he, as you could guess, is going to focus upon the ideas that were percolating at that time, and he is going to try to influence the reader that those ideas lit a fire, not only amongst the American leaders of the rebellion, but the rank and file, the regular American people, that they were highly motivated by those ideas that were spreading at that time. So he's going to look at evidence for the written word and the spoken word spreading throughout the colonies. He's going to look for evidence of uh, that 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 well, I hate to, it sounds negative in saying this, okay? And I use it in a more generic term, I intend to, and that is a propaganda, right? He's going to look for evidence of propaganda doing its job, influencing the decisions of rebellious movements and groups, etc., right? So you have Bernard Bailyn's thesis. Then you have a British thesis that has held strongly to this day, and you find that actually on number one, and it's known as salutary neglect. It's a term used by Edmund Burke back in England, and the name kind of says a lot, right? Is that we were neglected, right? We were neglected by Mother England as the 13 colonies here. However, it had a healthy or salutary effect on our colonies, that we were actually better for that neglect. All right. So notice this one's not as romantic, right? Because the argument is basically saying, right, that during this period from 1607 to 1775, when the rebellion began, right, that American colonies took advantage of Mother England's poor enforcement of her colonial reign over us. So that poor enforcement largely is put into two categories. One is political, and the other one is economic. So, is there evidence that Mother England did not enforce, for instance, her mercantilist restrictions very well? Remember, mercantilism, right? Is that the government believes that resources are finite, and it is the prerogative, the right of the government to determine the allocation of those resources unapologetically. So, hence, right, noblemen, well connected, powerful bourgeois factions back in England connected to parliament as lobbyist groups. They'll get, for instance, certain monopolistic privileges that they alone, the Royal African Colony, can trade in slaves, right? The English East India Company alone can trade tea to the colonies, right? Those would be examples. Um, Also, with the navigation laws, they made it tough on American colonies. They contended that American colonies could not manufacture certain products because they wanted us to remain at the mercy of Mother England and buy those manufactured products from England, right? Uh, they um, they wanted our merchants to use British middlemen, right? These factor they were called factors generically, British middlemen and Scottish middlemen who would provide loans and credit to our businesses and our farmers. And of course, have the money owed to them rather than to an American or some other European middleman. They would oftentimes determine the market and the prices at which the American goods would be sold. And in some cases, right, the American merchants, when allowed to participate in economic transactions, had to go to England first, even if it were, let's say, the market were just simply the Caribbean, the British West Indies, right here beneath us. They still had to travel 3,000 miles across the ocean and pay a tax in London, Bristol, Liverpool, and pay for the right to trade those commodities. And so those mercantilist restrictions, right, according to this thesis, they were not carried out very effectively. And so hence we did economically what we pleased. And then politically, the argument is that our people, right, began a precedent early on of demanding political representation in the colonies, and those representative bodies, namely, right, the town hall meetings at the local level, and the positions of sheriff and alderman and these other local positions, right, were put more in local hands to decide. And then, of course, ultimately the assemblies. Remember, the assemblies were the elected reps by the colonial citizens, right? And they were the lower branch of the legislators of the 13 colonies. And so did they, right? Did they acquire certain rights, certain powers that Mother England never truly intended, but they gained them nevertheless. So then, according to this narrative, at the end of the French and Indian War, the British tried to reorganize the 13 colonies to better exact money from them, because the British government was 137 million shillings or pounds in debt at the end of the French and Indian War and was in dire need of funds. And then also, right, there was a need for better administrative control because the colonies developed a reputation for, especially in the frontier areas, for lawlessness and crime and wars with Native American tribes that were very costly for the British Empire to control. And so hence there was somewhat of a crackdown in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, whereby the British Parliament and new King George III are going to try to better organize, more tightly organize the colonies and gain income from them, right, and better control them. And so, according to this thesis, right, the Americans basically were spoiled brats who were left alone, did as they pleased, did very well on their own, and then simply fought, right, because proverbially dad came home and they were 18 and well established in their independence and and in their prosperity, and dad comes home when they're 18 and says there's going to be you know some some more strict laws that are better enforced now. And of course the son or daughter says, sorry dad, too little too late. And so hence we fought to keep a good thing going. We fought to keep that autonomy, that semi-independence, that prosperity going. And so this is a popular interpretation in the British Isles to this very day, right? That they were kind of spoiled brats who fought to keep up our way of governing ourselves. All right. And so number two is Bernard Balin's court history. I've already broadly spoke of that. And then revising things, right? When you look at number three, This is great man history on George Washington. Remember, that doesn't contend that he was a great man ethically. That just means, right, that the undergirding assumption is that if you want to look at how things and why things went the way they did, you look at key people in powerful positions, right? Great men in great positions, and see, look into their personalities, look into their behavior, right? Look into their motivations, and that supposedly gives you. It's kind of an old school way of doing history, but it supposedly gives you a good window into why things happen the way they did. With revisionist, right, it's going to revise, it's going to change, it's going to challenge the court history that's rather patriotic and romantic. And it's going to show a selfish and ambitious side to George Washington. All right. And more than imply or suggest that maybe had George Washington's personal ambitions not been thwarted by the British and by the British system, or particularly a patronage, that maybe he wouldn't even have joined, much less led the rebellion, had he just simply received what he wanted selfishly. But notice also, right, I would say number three is meant to be mildly revisionist, and from Joseph Ellis's book on him, because to me, right, there's evidence that George Washington in this book felt as if, not just for himself, but for all Americans, that the patronage system was unfair, was unjust, was not in line with the natural rights of human beings and of English citizens, all right, or subjects. And so when I say patronage, right, it's the idea that your political connections give you the opportunities that you have, as opposed to what? Merit, right? As opposed to earning or deserving the position that you receive. So there was an open system, right, of nobility. People back in England, right? If you had to be part of the nobility, right? Remember, aristocracy, aristoi means the best in Greek. So you were considered, right, a better sort if you were part of the reigning nobility. And of course, they claimed lineage, right? Their blood went back to leaders of Britannia at the fall of Roman Britannia to the Angles and Saxons, all the way back like in the 400s AD. And so they claim, right, to come from a highly connected bloodline. Okay. And so because of that, they felt entitled to serve in the House of Lords, that they alone, as noblemen, could serve in the House of Lords, not the common people, that they alone could be granted trading monopolies and certain opportunities for land acquisition that other people were not entitled to, had no chance for, right? So the English, they carried that nobility system and that system of patronage, that you have to have the blessing of the higher ups to gain a certain opportunity or privilege, right? They carried that over technically to the 13 colonies. And you see evidence of George Washington being left out and being angry about that. But like I said, I subjectively would claim, having read this book, that it was somewhat moderately revisionist, and that you don't just simply see a selfish man just going out for his, right, as far as his own ambitions and concerns. But like I said, you have windows in this book whereby George Washington states that this patronage system for all Americans, not just for himself, was unfair, was unnatural, right, as the Enlightenment would say. And so hence he wanted a freer, more open society here in the Americas that was based upon talent, that was based upon merit, right? Whereby the most qualified, the most talented, the most hardworking and diligent people receive the position, and not those simply well connected who could buy that position. All right. So think about that. All right. As you read number three, and please read all of them, okay, no matter which ones you choose to analyze and evaluate. And number four is Howard Zinn's thesis. All right. And again, if you think number three is somewhat cynical, number four was meant to be conveyed in an even more cynical, on a more cynical note. Howard Zinn, remember, on page 10 of his People's History of the United States, is a Marxist historian, right? He believes that, in particular, right, the beginnings of our capitalist system, and long before that, the mercantilist system, were inherently unfair, were inherently unethical, were inherently parasitical for one person to gain or to win, right, it had to be at the expense of someone else. So he makes it clear on page 10 of his book, right off the get go, that he believes in conflict history, looking at history and explaining it in terms of power plays, right? The desire for the word they oftentimes use is hegemony or domination, right? For economic and political hegemony, domination. And of course, he wants to elicit our sympathy for those who lost, right? Those who economically, politically, socially did not get to dictate terms, did not have a piece of the pie, right? Did not have any power or many opportunities, but were hence kind of marginalized, right? Kicked to the corner without the same opportunities. So he makes that clear, right? So when he sees the founding fathers, he sees them as like a middle echelon of self-interested, manipulative men, right? White English men who are well-to-do, right? And by the way, you fast forward and you look at a lot of these leaders of the War for Independence, just look at a picture or look into the Constitutional Convention, right? Fast forward it to the summer of 1787. The majority of them, you guys, were lawyers, right? Many of them were lawyers. They were many of them were college educated. That was not a mini example. That was not a microcosm of the colonies themselves, right? Lawyers, those who were college educated, constituted like a tenth of 1% of the population. So this was a group, right, that saw themselves arguably as the cream of the crop, not as your average mechanic who worked with his hands for a living or your average sharecropping farmer, right? So at any rate, he looks at them and he sees them having their own agenda as a class of people, right? And he sees them, jealously holding on to whatever power they have accumulated during the colonial era over those who were poorer, who were not in their position, right? Like I said, the manual laborers and the poor itinerant sharecroppers, et cetera, right? And the very small scale cash crop farmers who try to grow a product for profit, right? So these well-to-do men, he says, they develop their own agenda, right? They clearly had reason to want the British out because many of them, like George Washington, et cetera, right, were not technically members of the nobility. Their last name, they didn't have the right last name and family lineage to go to the very top, to be handpicked on the royal councils, right? To be given the best of lands and the best monopolistic opportunities in trade, et cetera, right? But oftentimes they were selected as the assemblymen, right? As the elected reps of their people. And they were seen as being kind of the cream of the crop amongst the colonists, as kind of this middling sector between the British leaders and the common Americans, right? And so when you look at his book, you'll find evidence of them not being on the same page and even being perceived as enemies, these founding fathers, if you will, right, by the common colonists themselves. So you can look up the regulator movement. You can look up the Paxton Boys. You find evidence in this chapter of his book called The Kind of Revolution, whereby there are going to be colonial protests, especially on the western frontier areas of poor squatters, right, trying to earn a living and make a living desperately on the western fringes of their colonies, who were going to resent their own assemblymen, saying that these men did not have their best interest in mind, that they were taxing them but not giving them any of the benefits of government as far as protection against Native Americans, as far as a voice in government in the assemblies themselves, right, etc. So some of them are actually even going to go above the head of their assemblymen, these founding fathers, and complain to their royal governors, right, and to some of the British authorities, saying that our reps are not doing their job. And so, hence, right, he contends that these founding fathers, at the time of the Stamp Act riots and mob violence, right, of 1765, and things will only get worse, that supposedly he quotes John Adams and others, that this middling sector of well-to-do founding fathers became convinced that they were having a class war on their hands, that the poor, the common laborers of the cities and the shiftless and the poor, desperate ones that were squatting on the western frontier areas, that they were going to have an indiscriminate rebellion against all the well-to-do, and that just didn't count the British. That counted themselves as well. This rebellion was going to turn its ugly head toward them, the future founding fathers, as well as the Brits. So, hence, right, what he contends is they very shrewdly, very manipulatively hijacked this rebellion. They took it over. All right. So when you look at things like the committees of correspondence, right, that tried to unite the colonial protest and tried to unite the colonial assemblies in the 13 colonies and tried to form a leadership, if you will, and a hierarchy amongst the rebels, that were they trying to take control over these poor peasants and these poor urban colonists, right? So, of course, they could decide, right, how radical this revolution would become. Because, after all, right, uh, Thomas Jefferson and these well-to-do large planters and slave-owning, uh, Southerners, as well as the leaders that were the bourgeois leaders up in the North, like John Hancock and John Adams, etc. They did not ever volunteer to share their wealth with the poor. They didn't push for direct democracy, right? They even pushed for limiting the power of representative democracy. There's evidence of a rather a distrust of the common colonist, okay, and not putting too much power in his or her hands. So hence, right, were they wanting to control uh, this movement, this rebellion, so they could ensure, right, that there would be no property redistribution, no popular democracy, nothing like a French Revolution during the Jacobin stage of rule, right? Nothing that radical, because they themselves would fall victim to this, being well-to-do themselves. And then, of course, right, they used the Enlightenment, Scottish liberalism, and this libertarian movement. Um, the Great Awakening, etc. They use these ideas, right? Not necessarily because they believed in them so strongly, says Howard Zinn in this very cynical thesis, but they used it as propaganda, right? Because after all, they can't be honest with a common American colonist if this is true, if this ugly thesis is true, and say, you know what, we don't think much of you. We want the British out so we could be the leaders, right, and rule over you and not share too much economically with you and not share too much political power with you. But we need you, we need your numbers to fight with and for us, right? We need you to be our cannon fodder and fight and die on the fields of battle for us against the mighty British armed forces. They can't say that honestly, right, and enlist the help of the common colonials. So what they must do is convince them through propaganda. No, we believe in natural rights. We believe in the inherent equality of all human beings and all Englishmen, right? And we're going to have an enlightened and better world once we kick the British out, one in which you'll have many more opportunities than you presently have, more voice in government, etc. So was this kind of a series of kind of a quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You let us, as the colonial leaders, remain as your leaders, right? And we will promise you some crumbs from the table. We'll promise you some rights, some opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's the very cynical thesis that you will read on number 4. Okay. So before I get into context of this war for independence, does anyone have any questions about numbers 1 through 4? All right. So you guys are awfully quiet. So, what would I consider subjectively to no matter what your historical interpretation is, what your underlying assumptions are, what would I consider to be, somewhat considered relevant context, no matter what way you're looking at this war for independence? Remember, context is the surrounding situation, the surrounding circumstances that need to be considered in trying to better understand this topic, right? So for one, to me, right, is ambiguity of status. Remember, English common law is organic, right? Like a living plant or living growing organism. It's meant to evolve, gradually over time. So there's no at this time definitive English constitution whereby you could go to it and say, okay, Article 12, section 3 makes it very clear on this topic. A lot, right? No, it's not that clear cut. With the English system, right? They go by precedent, right? By past decisions that were made and continue to be made uh, in kind of a compromising manner. So, for instance, the obvious example is parliamentary laws, right? From the time of 1688, at the time of the Glorious Revolution, England has already had a civil war. Charles I, as the king, has already lost his head, literally, and Parliament has gained supremacy over the king or queen. Okay. And so William and Mary vow that they're ruling, right, at the supremacy of Parliament. And Parliament itself had evolved during the early modern and late medieval time period, somewhat evolving from like the Privy Council that just simply gave counsel to the king or queen. And we don't have time to get into it. And I am not that well read on early modern English history anyway. But at any rate, Parliament by 1688 has evolved to become the primary political body, right? Whereby legitimacy or sovereignty rests. And remember, with sovereignty, right? What is the main source of authority? To me, power is when someone has you down on the ground and until you push that person off you, that person has power. Authority to me is when you give up. You no longer try to push that person off you and you concede, right? You defer and say, you know what, you're my leader and I accept it. So, what is the source of authority? The sense of legitimate government that people concede to. Well, by 1688, arguably, Parliament is that source. Okay. Now, the king or queen was not just the figurehead that we see now, right? The king or queen, still at this time, was choosing the prime minister, kind of like the German Kaiser would do for centuries later with the Chancellor of Germany, because by now, right, it's the majority party in parliament. They choose the prime minister. It's more democratic today. At that time, the prime minister was handpicked by the crown and could be removed at will by the crown, right? At this time, still, the crown was saying no to people like John Wilkes in England, who was seen as a radical rabble rouser during the mid 1700s back in England, who was complaining that not all parliamentary districts in England were being properly represented, like Manchester and Birmingham. Big cities were developing, and they didn't even have anybody that they were allowed to elect into parliament. And so John Wilkes and others, right, they fought against this. They went over the head of parliament straight to the people with mass rallies and with their writings in the press, etc. And they got in trouble. And George III had him removed from his parliamentary chair or seat. And so the crown certainly had more power in issuing royal edicts, etc., right, than the king or queen has today. But still, again, right, it's organic. It evolves throughout history, right? And so you have parliamentary decisions, you have royal edicts, right, decided and promulgated by kings and queens. You had decisions made by their major court system, right? So you had certain cases that were considered very significant to be obeyed and abided by after judges had made certain key decisions about citizenship for certain groups, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so, those are the main, and there are other areas as well. But it's a very interesting topic. So my point being, right, is you had different kings and queens, different parliamentary bodies that allowed Massachusetts Bay Colony to have a colony, Jamestown to have a colony, Lord Baltimore to have Maryland, William Penn to have Pennsylvania, right? And so you had some that were proprietary colonies that were to be owned by a proprietor or owner, like William Penn and Lord Baltimore, right? You had some that were royal colonies, whereby the um, the English government decided on the governor. The governor decided on his own council, and then only the assembly was allowed to be elected amongst the subjects, the English subjects in that colony. You had some colonies that were where it was made clear, either clear or ambiguous, actually, that they were to have all the rights of Englishmen back in England itself, right? And that they were to have sovereignty to make their own laws as long as they didn't contravene or contradict any of the royal edicts or parliamentary laws back in England, right? So Massachusetts Bay, all the way up through the rebellion, is going to contend that there was a lot of latitude in their particular 1630 charter that gave them virtual autonomy to do whatever they pleased as long as they didn't contradict English common law back in England itself, right? And so then to add to this unclearness, this ambiguity, is what about subjectship? They didn't use the term citizenship yet, but subjectship, right? The rights of an Englishman. Well, you had, like you hear these Latin terms, jus soli, jus sanguinis. Uh, so they had precedents, again, according to court decisions, that some said if you are the son, because remember, this did not include women, if you are the son of an English parent, particularly an English father, right? No matter where you're born in the British realms, especially, right? Outside of England, you were entitled to the rights of an English subject. Then others contended, right, that rather than by blood, it was being born in the British realms, right? And this got very confusing, especially if you were like a Scot, and the Scots were included into Great Britain in 1707 and Northern Ireland as well. So, what happens, right, when you're born in Scotland prior to 1707? After 1707. And so they had to have one decision made after another to try to definitively decide this, right? What were the rights of Englishmen? And so, hence, at the time of the War for Independence, or just prior to it, Benjamin Franklin is going to do his history. He's going to look at certain precedents in English history, certain decisions made back in England, certain parliamentary laws made back in England, certain royal edicts, and also particular colonial charters, right, in certain particular colonies. And he's going to make an argument one after the next as to why the English colonists are entitled to representation, to the rights of what we would call collectively now due process if you're charged or suspected of having committed a crime, certain commercial rights, etc. Right? And the fact that he's even having to debate this demonstrates that it was ambiguous. It was not clear what our rights were as English subjects, particularly, of course, sadly, just the English American men. All right. Um, and we haven't even talked about property requirements, right? The whole idea of a stake in society, the idea that if you're not a landowning taxpayer, that you stand nothing to lose if the government were imperiled, and hence you could not be counted upon as a loyal subject of the crown and parliament. And so there were lots of variables that went into play to make this, for lack of a better adjective, a messy situation, right? And I find it interesting also as the war goes on, progressively you are going to see in our propaganda the term human rights. Okay, that will be used, but for a long time, up leading into the rebellion, the term that was more often used, arguably, was English rights. So were we fighting for human rights? Because the idea is, right, a human right is inviolable, it's inalienable, right? As Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, it cannot be alienated from you. You're entitled to it from the moment you were born as a human being. That's an Enlightenment concept, right? Whereas an English right is a civic right. It's a man-made, man-given right. And the argument is, of course, that it's less secure because what the government gives, the government can take away. But if it's a natural right, you're entitled to it from the get-go, and the government is obliged to obey it and acknowledge it, right? And not take it away at any subsequent time. So at any rate, moving on from this, okay? And then John Locke, he wrote his second treatise on government. And this is kind of the origin, as well as a guy named Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And literally the name of his book is The Social Contract, translated into English. But the idea of the social contract. All right. This is going to be alive and well in the 1600s, and it's going to come back with a bang in the 1740s during the Enlightenment. And what does it really entail? Is to me, right? If you'll indulge me, perhaps a poor example. Imagine if we as a class went on a trip and for some awful reason, right, there was a plane crash that we survived and we found ourselves marooned on an island. We would find ourselves technically, right, on this uninhabited island, hypothetically, back to a state of nature where there are no legal institutions at that time existing. It's each man and woman for him or herself. And we decide right initially that we are going to enjoy that state of nature and the freedom that it entails. So we each get to do our own thing, right? But the idea is, of course, is human nature being what it is supposedly, that that eventually we're going to somewhat regret that state of nature, and that we're going to engage in a cost benefit analysis, and that one after another we're going to progressively, let's just say hypothetically, in this with this philosophical inquiry, that we're going to find our cell phones to be stolen. We're going to find our clothes or anything that we own on our persons that could be used to fish, hunt for food, anything that could abet our survival, right? That it's going to progressively begin to be stolen by other individuals. Then perhaps they go further than that, and they began extorting. We began extorting one another, and someone says, okay, waking someone up on the island and saying, okay, you're going to catch me some fish and some food and light me a fire and help me provide a refuge. And if you don't, I'm going to do this or that. And they threaten us and they take away our liberty, right? So that basically our inherent right to life, liberty, and property become imperiled in an absolute state of nature with absolute freedom. Because human nature being what it is, people will inevitably abuse their freedom and begin infringing on the rights and freedoms of other people. So then, right, we get together and in cost benefit analysis fashion, we say, you know what, we're really enjoying our freedom, but not at the cost of what's happening now, right? So, as a lesser evil, as a necessary evil, let's agree to devise a government. But that government will not be our master, right? That government will be our servant. They are to protect our life, liberty, and property. They are to ensure that none of us is any longer extorted by anyone else, that none of our property becomes stolen by anybody else, and that they will protect those natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And so when we get together and elect this body, after a certain period of time, if they're not doing their job, we declare the right of revolution, and we'll get together again and decide they're not doing their job, and we're going to elect, five or however many people to who will better carry out that chore of being our servant and protecting our natural rights. That's what you find, right, in the Declaration of Independence, right, by Thomas Jefferson, that we have certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and instead of property, he more generically says the pursuit of happiness. I might argue subjectively that with the pursuit of happiness, you're talking about combining not only property, not only the right to make a better life for yourself and enjoy the fruits of your own hard work and labor, but also the right of self cultivation, to be able to educate yourself, learn a trade, and try to broaden your horizons, right? I connect that to like Diderot and Condorcet, the guys who wrote the French encyclopedia, the right for the person to engage in self cultivation. That's just me, but I subjectively read that into it when I see pursuit of happiness put in place of property. But at any rate, he had read, right, Jefferson, his John Locke and his Rousseau, okay, and these other Enlightenment writers. So these are some of the ideas, okay? If you'll indulge me to skip, since we're talking about ideas, I'm going to go down to the English and Scottish opposition and the French and Scottish Enlightenment. Um, the social
I
contract.
got Mr. Cowell, I got a question
Yes.
real quick,
Yeah.
not before you keep going
Yeah,
on.
please.
Just in general, my question is why did basically why did Britain allow the colonists to not obey all of the British laws? Because you talked about a lot of obeying and like So that question came to mind.
No, that's a great question. And my answer for it is pretty weak. It's like what you find in the textbook is for one, right? Is the British had bigger fish to fry for a long time. They literally go through civil wars, continental wars. They gain control of India, which they would consider their crown jewel and more significant to their well-being as an empire than North America.
Right.
Of course, at the end of the French and Indian War, Canada, the Caribbean, the West Indies were huge in bringing about profit, etc. So they only have so many customs. Their bureaucracy through the Navy was through the customs officials. The customs officials were like their highway patrolmen, if you will, to
Right.
enforce their mercantilist laws. Um, they were not paid well. It was seen as a mere stepping stone for better positions elsewhere. And so hence they didn't have enough men to enforce it. The men that were there could not wait, arguably, to get to a better position. Not being paid well, you have the temptation to take bribes, which would enrich yourself much better, much right, uh, as far as taking bribes from these smugglers. Okay, uh, and they, like I said, they have their own issues and problems back in Europe, so that it just was never that high of a priority. And I
Right.
know that's kind of a weak answer, but that's what you're going to find time and time again in the history books.
Right. Right. And then my last question,
Sure.
for you, like kind of like a personal, like history kind of question,
Hmm.
because I was reading over the first article and taking notes as you were talking. So my question to you is, do you think because of I don't even know if I'm saying this word right, the
Salutary.
salutary neglect, do you think it was a factor that led to the American Revolutionary War?
Oh yeah. Honest to goodness, I know this is a diplomatic answer, but I feel, it doesn't have to be either or, right? Like
Right.
reality is complex, it's messy. I think that you do a disservice when you neglect to look at any of these four arguments. I mean, any
Right.
single one of them that you leave out, I think you are taking out relevant context that ought to be considered. I,
Right.
I do. I think it was that messy, it was that complex, that there's an element of truth to all four of these arguments.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. All right. And so, yeah, look into like the data. Most of the data that I use on number one with the salutary neglect thesis comes from Paul Johnson's book, his History of the American People. And I think he does a very good job of giving, concrete data. So, for instance, the assemblies. I don't have it memorized, but if you look back at number one, he gives case after case of one colonial assembly after another gaining a certain power against or in relation to their own royal governor or their own royal council. Certain powers that they accumulated, whereby, for instance, they got to decide to tax their own people. Because after all, right, that becomes a mantra during the War for Independence: no taxation without representation. Well, nothing in English common law uh, directed us to be entitled to actual representation, right? Whereby every subject of the English crown was entitled to elect a rep to serve as his or her voice in Parliament. You're not going to find it under English common law. But yet again, when you look at Paul Johnson's history, right, you find case after case of certain colonial assemblies, especially in the New England area, garnering that right, and saying no, taxes will not be collected, but with the assembly's permission. And when you look at frontiers, right, in Gordon S. Wood's books, frontier areas, people moving out to the West, and then they almost immediately petition their own colonial assemblymen, right, and say, hey, this is a new village here in the Western periphery of the colony. So, for instance, like Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Maryland, they're going to develop they're going to have these claims to Western territory that's not incorporated yet, right? No actual recognized towns, and it's ambiguous who controls that area. The colonies claiming it, but certain Native American tribes are also claiming it, right? So you get squatters who go into that area and they begin establishing towns, and they start electing amongst themselves constables or sheriffs, right, and their own town councils, and they petition their colonial assembly and saying, guess what, guys, whether you like it or not, we're elected in three reps, and they're going to be a part of your colonial assembly because technically we're part of Maryland or of Pennsylvania or whatever the colony was, right? So the Americans began demanding and to a certain extent succeeding in claiming the right to represent themselves on the western peripheries and in the colonial assemblies. And then the assemblies themselves are going to jealously vie for power against the councilmen above them and against their own governors. And so, yeah, I think it's I think Paul Johnson deserves to have a good look, right, by all of us in his book as far as the possible merits of this salutary neglect thesis, because I feel like he gives some rather compelling evidence of the colonists through their assemblies of just demanding and achieving certain rights and powers and privileges one after another throughout this colonial period. So yeah, absolutely. I think that whether you adhere to that thesis or not, I think there's enough data to support it that it at least merits our consideration. This salutary neglect thesis, and then not to mention, right, when you look at the Tory Party back in English Parliament, when you look at George III as a Hanoverian king at this time period, as a young man, you have a lot of quotes, right, from them, whereby they seem to project that image that the American colonists needed to be put in their place. That for too many years, enforcement of the laws was not adequately, carried out, and that they had smuggled and done what they pleased economically. That their assemblies had acquired, in their own eyes, too many powers, right? And that they needed to be put in their place at the end of the French and Indian War. And in particular, right, you look at the hostilities beginning in Lexington and Concord, where the first fighting took place. You have a lot of evidence of the Tories in Parliament who believed that American colonies needed to be firmly put in their place, right, as well as some Whigs, the Liberal Party, as well. Although the Whigs were very torn on this issue. Uh, they You have also quotes in particular about the New England colonies, right, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and Rhode Island, etc., right, suggesting that they believed, as well as George III himself, that the New England colonies were the rabble rousing leaders of this rebellion. That if they were to just be put in their place in the New England area, that the rest of this rebellion would die off in turn. And when you look at demographically, right, uh, you don't have these gentry farmers and slave owning plantation owners in the New England area. You have bourgeois people, right? People from the city connected to commerce, to trade, right? And to these, for whom these mercantilist restrictions absolutely um, pertain to their success or failure as businessmen. And so hence, right, you have quotes from the English government whereby they believed a lot of this rebellion was tied into these bourgeois New England leaders who were trying to rebel against the mercantilist system and had rebelled and succeeded in that rebellion for years, and now needed to be put in their place and only had their own pocketbook in mind as far as their own motivations. So yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Chetney, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did, and very like thoroughly.
Okay, I hope so. I don't know about that,
Yeah.
but thank you. But yeah, you guys, please, by any means, I just keep blabbing and blabbing. Anybody have any questions, please throw them at me, okay? And I'll do my best to answer them or to lead you to a good source at least. All right. And so some of these Enlightenment writings, okay, during the 1740s, etc., that came at a very convenient time for our rebellion. You have notions of natural rights. Again, like I mentioned, right? Rights that people are entitled to because of their humanity, right? That governments are obligated or ought to be obligated to recognize. You have what would later perhaps be codified into our First Amendment rights. People like Voltaire, right? Voltaire. Voltaire was really big on the right of self-expression, that you ought to have the right to call your government out on abuses and infringement on people's rights, to rebel against them with a written word. Voltaire, in many ways, was kind of an iconoclast, right? Someone who just on principle went after whatever society considered to be sacred and felt like it was his God-given right to do so. So I think of like today, for lack of a better, analogy, like South Park or something. So he went after, Catholic and Anglican priests, um, uh, kings and queens, and noblemen, etc. Right, and literally, made fun of them, get, propagated negative stereotypes about them, wanted people to hold them better accountable with their actions, etc. You also have notions of self cultivation, like I mentioned with Diderot, spelt like Diderot, Didorot, and Condorcet, Condorcet, who were for the average person to be able to cultivate him or herself, right? To be educated and gain access to college, to gain access to all the different economic trades, and to go as far as his or her hard work and talent would allow him or her to go. Okay. Um, you had notions of the rights of people when they are accused of a crime. And I think of Beccaria, Beccaria. Beccaria's writings, right, were like against cruel and unusual punishment, so that you shouldn't be subjected to torture, to be forced into confessing something, right? That you should have a right to be tried by peers, by people who are from your same economic class, from your same region of origin, who know what it's like to live in your shoes and can empathize with you and give you some semblance of justice, right? Whether or not you're guilty of this or that. So, a big issue with this, right, is what if you were guilty of violating the mercantilist laws, trading without the official papers, trading without going to England first and paying the tax, right? Should you be tried by your own peers back in the colonial, venue of other colonial peers, or should you be tried by the British Navy, which were known as the Vice Admiralty Courts? And as you might guess, right, to many of the Americans in our propaganda, to be tried in a vice admiralty court was like to be sent to Guantanamo Bay, right? Whereby you are not going to be deprived, you're going to be deprived of any fair representation. You were likely considered guilty right off the get go and had no chance of being exonerated. And they were going to throw away the lock and the key and lock you in for good, right? And so, at any rate, that was largely, relevant to what was going on. The notions of someone accused of a crime. You had people writing about a sense of equity, fairness, and balance in government, right? Like Montesquieu in his book Spirit of the Laws. And so his notions of checks and balances, that no single individual, no single body of the English government or any government for that matter ought to have unlimited power, that they ought to be held in check, right, by certain uh, concomitant powers, other powers that ran counter to their own. So hence Parliament, there ought to be an upper body and lower body, and they ought to have checks and balances with one another. There ought to be a chief executive and have checks and balances with and against and under Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. So Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws was big at this time. You also had the English and Scottish liberals, and they were largely libertarian at that time, right? Government, don't tread on me, keep government as small and unobtrusive into our lives as possible. And it was the notion, right, that human nature is incongruent. It does not run well with unlimited power. That, as Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams, that he says basically even you and I would become wolves if the people allowed us to become such, right? That no human being can and ought to be trusted with what they called arbitrary power. Because remember, if something's arbitrary, it doesn't consistently adhere to any logic or limitations. It's just up to the whim and desire of the ruler, right? And so that was, of course, a byword that we wanted to avoid in the Scottish and English uh, uh, Enlightenment, if you will, at this time. And so no one should have arbitrary power. There ought to be systems of checks and balances, et cetera, et cetera. And so Benjamin Hoadley was against the Anglican bishops and the Anglican church having religious authority over people's lives. The Great Awakening, which was big here in the colonies, stated right that deference, knowing your place, adhering to British authority when it comes to religion ought to be conditional. That when the Anglican authorities no longer obey God's precepts and biblical precepts, that the American colonists ought to feel free, not only free, but even obligated by their Christian God to rebel against them. Right. So, kind of notions setting the stage for like civil disobedience. Right. That you could disobey the civic man-made laws with a good conscience, knowing that those civic laws and those civic leaders are violating a higher divine law, right? Um, and so you have that in the Great Awakening. And so let's see here, what else? So I've mentioned some of these others. You have a gentleman's name Trenchard, Trenchard, and Gordon, and they wrote a piece called Cato's Letters, Cato apostrophe S, and they kind of amalgamated everything, right? Ideas of the French Enlightenment, ideas of the Scottish liberals, right? And then what they did is they looked at evidence of George III in particular. Before him, a prime minister chosen named Walpole, Walpole, that were guilty supposedly of a lot of nepotism, right? Giving positions to their buddies and family members, being kind of arbitrary and corrupt in their dealings. George III cutting deals and trying to win over Whigs, liberals, because he was a Tory back in England, and providing certain economic monopolies, lands, and titles to certain Whigs. And then what do you know? Those Whigs start voting in his direction in Parliament. Like I said, with in the case of John Wilkes, not even allowing certain people that were known as rabble rousers, who were elected by their constituents, to take a seat in Parliament. And so, with Cato's letters, they were looking at evidence of this type of corrupt and just corrupt behavior by the British Prime Minister and cabinet and the king, and they were tying them to these Enlightenment beliefs and these Scottish liberal beliefs and saying, look, people, see, they're clearly in violation of these principles. And they use somewhat scare tactics, right? And trying to convince their readers that there was almost a conspiracy amongst this new administration, these administrations under King George III, whereby he was trying to take England in a step backward, right? Because remember, when you talk about like a Whig party, right? They believed, right, that English common law, right, by way of decisions made, parliamentary laws, etc., royal edicts, that English common law was and ought to be evolving in a direction that was more and more democratic, right? Remember, demos are the people in Greek, so giving more power to the common English people, and more egalitarian, putting more people on equal footing, right? They believe that is the evolution that English common law was, had been, and ought in the future to take. Okay. And so in Cato's letters, they were trying to alarm people and say, look, people, George III and his hand-picked prime ministers are time and again trying to undo that evolution. They're trying to take us backward, and they're trying to strip us uh, in that from taking that evolutionary step toward more democracy and more egalitarianism, right?
So So it sounds like these Cato's letters were wrote as like an equality of all men.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And, when I say that though, right, a lot of it still was under the guise, instead of as opposed to the French Enlightenment, right, was real big on humanitarianism and the equality of all human beings, etc. And don't get me wrong, the French Enlightenment had plenty of contradictions also, but especially the Scottish liberal movement, because they were really big on English rights. So, for instance, you're not going to see much at all as far as the rights of women, the rights of even non-English German immigrants, much less African Americans and African people, Black Englishmen, etc. Right? So so yeah, it was limited in scope as far as really thinking about it by today's standards of egalitarianism, but at least was in its rhetoric, it was in that direction. And namely, right, for that time period, it was seen to be radical, and that it was for the common, non landowning, poor white Englishman who was, not represented in Parliament, not directly anyway. Okay. And so, no, that was a great comment and a great question. And so, with Cato's letters, for instance, right, Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, a lawyer here in Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, Ben Franklin, they're going to directly print Cato's letters here in the colonies to try to deliberately alarm the colonists here, right? That say, see, George III is a wannabe tyrant, and he's corrupt, and he's trying to reverse the direction of English common law and take away our rights as Englishmen, right? And our opportunities. Um, and they didn't just directly quote Cato's letters, as then of course they also paraphrased them in their own writings, right? So Letters from a Farmer by Dickinson, right? Multiple printing press uh, writings from Benjamin Franklin, uh, Thomas Jefferson and others, Hamilton. They're going to also write in editorials and columns, and they were going to use anonymous names. And oftentimes those names were tied um, to historic figures who were seen, right, as enemies of tyranny, as enemies of an oligarchy, of a few people corruptly ruling for their own good at the detriment of everybody else. So, for instance, right, like Cato itself back at Rome, Cicero, Tacitus, these other big names of Rome were tied to the Rome's republic, right, as opposed to Rome's empire when the emperor ruled or the Senate ruled as an oligarchy. They were big on the time when the tribunes, the elected leaders of the Roman people themselves, shared power during Rome's republic. So they were very selective and symbolic in the names that they used. And of course, they fought for the rights, right? They wanted everyone to become aware of what was going on during the 1770s in particular, how Parliament was trying to infringe upon certain rights that we had once enjoyed as colonies. And now they were trying to take us backward and deprive us of those rights, right? Especially in taking power from our assemblies, right? Because the colonial assemblies were our voice, our political voice, if you will, at the colonial level. Okay. And so, what some people might make the argument now, whether it was a fallacy, right, a break in logic, or was logical, that's up to conjecture. But they oftentimes used slippery slope logic, right? That what the government was doing today, however small the infringement on our right, however small that backward step was, where the colonial assembly once got to tax us, and now they can't tax us. Now Parliament can directly tax us 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, right? And they say with those initial taxes, the Sugar Act was first, then the Stamp Act, then the Townshend Acts, right? They were rather small in their revenue. The British did not extract much wealth in these taxes from us. Okay, they weren't that burdensome. But the idea is what they do today, however small, whatever infringement on our rights today, they will be able to expand upon in the future, and it will go on a negative, slippery slope, and eventually they will take us back to a state of nothing less in our rhetoric than slavery. They literally use that term. All right. So to them, right, these taxes, these backward steps, and the powers that our assemblies were enjoying um, were like these sinister plots to incrementally, one by one, take away our accumulated powers as colonies and colonial people and our rights one step at a time. So to them, it was the principle of it, right? And like I said, our propagandists at this time, our Benjamin Franklin's, John Dickinson's, Thomas Jefferson's, etc., they're going to run with this stuff and really heighten our sense of fear. Okay. And then colonial assemblymen are going to do their part with famous speeches to alarm us to that exact fear. And of course, arguably one of the most famous was Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry down in Virginia. All right. So, any questions so far? So, going back here, right, as far as like in the introduction of this, just be mindful that I'll have a question on test two regarding this introduction, as far as what's considered to be relevant context. So, for one, was demographic changes. The early to mid 1700s experienced a demographic boom in our colonies and in England's empire itself, but especially in the North American colonies. The population is going to explode. All right. Not only is it going to explode, but you're going to have urbanization. Cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia are going to explode in numbers, but also, right, migration. People are not only going to, in large numbers move into these port cities, but also perhaps not equally large number, but it also a large number will move away from the cities into the frontier areas, right? The western periphery of the colonies. In particular, right, the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, right? So let's say this is the Appalachians, this is the East Coast right here. Most of the population was between the Appalachians and the East Coast. Now, a large contingent of people are moving across the Appalachians, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. And in doing such, right, that had already been fought over in the French and Indian War. And there had been a great cost in money, in resources, and in men losing their lives, right, to win that Western periphery over and to try to come to peaceful terms with the Native American tribes. Then, no sooner is peace secured than you have Pontiac's Rebellion and some of these other rebellions in the Western periphery. And the British Parliament is thinking, my goodness, right? We just fought to have peace here. We have to have better administration over there to secure the peace because war is just too expensive. And so, hence, right, there is a need to gain a better foothold, a better administrative grip over the colonies because of these population changes. Okay. Larger numbers of people to contend with, as you might guess, throughout American history, right through the Second Industrial Revolution. When cities blow up in numbers, you're going to have, concomitant issues that arise with those numbers. Crime, you're going to need more officers of the law, perhaps more people elected into the representative bodies and government, and other types of issues, housing, fire precautions, all kinds of practical and other issues that arise, right, when the cities blow up in numbers. And then again, with the frontiers, you're trying to keep the peace, having just won this frontier in the costly French and Indian War. And so that usually is considered context to our rebellion, right? The British trying to kind of crack down on the colonies with these demographic changes. Then also the salutary neglect thesis, right? that the assemblies, especially in the New England area, are acquiring more and more rights and powers and privileges. And so Parliament and King George III are going to be, progressively threatened by that fact, right? Uh, Also, the ambiguity over our political status. Benjamin Franklin going to England to engage in debates, right? As far as what our rights constituted and what they did not, as Englishmen, a part of the British Empire here in the colonies, right? And so you have all these factors that are almost invariably, no matter what your thesis is, considered as relevant context, right? And then again, I think of equal note is political, occurrences back in England itself. Is England is going to face disturbances back at home. The Scottish and English liberals that I've mentioned, right? The libertarians are like with Cato's letters, are going to try to alarm the English population itself. Look out for the Walpole administration. Look out for George III. They're reversing the trends of English democratic evolution, right? And are corrupt, etc. The Rotten Borough campaign, whereby certain boroughs or districts were not represented at all in Parliament, and then just the opposite. You had some cities or villages that virtually were uninhabited, yet they were allowed to have multiple reps represent them. So the system, as far as direct representation, was imbalanced and unfair back in England, and they're going to have drama about that. The Whigs, by and large, wanted to cooperate with us, wanted to give us the benefit of the doubt as far as our rights as Englishmen, um, and did not want to use force against her own colonies, against their quote American cousins. Because remember, demographically, historically, America was very kind of WASP at that time. Most of the migrants at one period or another had come from the British Isles. And so literally were by blood and heritage connected to England. And then the Tories were more apt to believe that Americans need to be put in their place, that we were arrogant and defiant, and there needed to be more of a forceful attitude toward us. So England itself is going to, I've heard it reckoned by some historians, uh, our war for independence as like England's Vietnam, that they're going to have literally fistfights in Parliament over this issue. And they're going to, especially as the war becomes more costly in numbers, right? They're going to progressively refuse to send more of their English boys over here to North America to fight and risk their lives. So it's going to hamper their military effort in putting down our rebellion, because literally Parliament will progressively refuse to send more soldiers over here because it was an unpopular and controversial war. And then also in likeness to Vietnam is when you look at most of the pitched battles, the English arguably won most of the battles in our war for independence. They really did. But their tactics just didn't seem to work well. Is they would take over cities. Our first and second, our second Continental Congress, right? Our defiant independent government in Philadelphia. So the British, Howe and his men came and took over Philadelphia for a while, right? And that didn't seem to work. They would take cities, and our guys, like in Valley Forge, would just hide out and wait, 7 to 12 miles away from the capital, wait for them to eventually leave that big city and take them on. We engaged in a little warfare, right, with the Spanish termed guerrilla warfare, right? And so uh, like I said, they would win a lot of the battles and take over major cities, but that in the long run did not secure their victory. They oftentimes would elicit a lot of people who were neutral or almost indifferent or couldn't choose a side. The British at times had a way of pushing those on the fence toward the rebellion, like Lord Dunmore of Virginia. He declared that any of our slaves who fought with the British Army against this rebellion would be guaranteed their freedom. And so, needless to say, right, that alarmed a lot of Southern planters and Southern white racists who were concerned that the British government was trying to foment or initiate a race war. down in the South. And not to mention the atrocities that the press ran with Bannister Tarleton, the butcher Tarleton, and him refusing to give quarter on certain infamous occasions to Americans trying to surrender. And so the British had a way, like especially in the South, of making enemies as well. And then, of course, we're going to gain French help. We're going to gain an alliance with Louis the 16th of France. And the idea is, right, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the French had just lost Canada in key areas in the French and Indian War to the British. And they would love to see the British lose some of their empire. And so they helped us out, and that was highly pivotal. When you look at the surrender at Yorktown in Virginia, there were supposedly 3 French soldiers for every American rebel soldier. And to such an extent that Cornwallis wanted to surrender to the French rather than to us and our Continental Army. And so it's a very, very intriguing topic, this war for independence. And so when you look at the basic narrative, the British, right, they're going to implement the Sugar Act of 1764, and they're for the first time going to tax certain commodities, right, that we have that our assemblies did not give consent to. And so about 5 to 8 colonial assemblies formally petitioned the British Crown, saying, wait a minute, this hasn't been our tradition. Parliament has not usually directly taxed us, right? Then it's taken a step further with a stamp tax, because that's going to be less inclined to just be an import tax, right, of sugar and other commodities coming in to our colonies and added to the price of that commodity. Now it's a direct tax collected in the colonies with the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act was huge in eliciting protest, right? And at that time, now you're going to get several, I want to say 9, several colonial assemblies unite with the Stamp Act Congress and contend, right, officially, we will not collect taxes that are not okayed by our assemblies. And by that time, of course, you're going to have these non-political entities that are going to develop literally in taverns or bars and in other extra legal environments that were not connected to our official assemblies, that will later morph into the Sons of Liberty chapters, right? So these Sons of Liberty and these other grassroots organizations, historians like Gordon S. Wood run with that and say, see, the average American was participating in this rebellion, felt entitled to participate in it, that it was not just run by our demagogue assemblymen leaders, our elected leaders. But then again, our assembly leaders form the committees of correspondence. And some look at that very cynically, because they said, okay, well, ostensibly it's to make sure that the colonial assemblymen and the Sons of Liberty chapters are in unison as far as what's going on with communication, what the British are up to, as far as what our colonial plans are in defiance of what the British are up to. But to some people, right, they felt like the committees of correspondence was an attempt by the elite assemblymen to keep control over the regular Sons of Liberty chapters and these grassroots organizations. It's a fascinating topic. And then right, the Daughters of Liberty and the Sons of Liberty are going to engage in the boycott and embargoes and refuse to buy these British products that are taxed, right? And so money talks, and the British lose money, and they repeal these taxes, but they do so with certain strong declarations, right, to accompany their decision to give in to American protest and take off these taxes. One was the Declaratory Act, saying, okay, we're taking the taxes away, but we wanted to make it clear in the future, Parliament has direct sovereignty over the colonies. They virtually represent the colonists and can tax them at will, right? And so that was a big statement that's going to lead to a clash, right? This Declaratory Act of 1766, I believe it was. Um, and then also the decision to keep a tax on tea as a symbol, right, and a reminder to us that Parliament could still tax us without our assembly's consent. And then after that, you're going to have the Townsend administration. They're going to come in and say, okay, no more stamp taxes that are directly uh, collected in the colonies. We're going to indirectly tax them just with imports coming in, right? Back to like the Sugar Act. Well, the Townsend Acts, there was a big rebellion against them, boycotts, mob violence, etc. Whereby, like I said, they're going to renege on those except for tea. And then from there, like from 1767 time period, you get into around 1770 in the beginning of that decade, and you're going to have the Boston Massacre, right? 5 people are killed in Boston, beginning with a fight with a colonial young man who got a job at a rope making factory over these British soldiers who were trying to get a side job. Where they're going to contend and have a personal issue, and there's going to be a fist fight, and it's going to lead to this American colonial young man running to the local uh, uh, presidio, if you will, the local barracks of soldiers, British soldiers, to have their leader protect him. And when he comes there, it does work in the short run. The soldiers can't harm him in front of their superior. But then a crowd goes around these people and they don't know what's going on. They start throwing snowballs and rocks and cursing at the soldiers. And then the soldiers fire into the crowd and kill 5 people. And the Preston guy, he contended to his death that he never ordered them to fire. And it had a very highly controversial um, uh, trial, right? And actually, ironically, John Adams, one of our rebel leaders, supported these British soldiers in that trial. But the decision just prior to this was to move 4,000 British soldiers into the Boston area of only 15,000 inhabitants. And right, remember, they're reading their Scottish libertarian writers who were saying, beware of a standing army. The government will devour its own people with a standing army and take away their liberties and take away their lives for that matter. And so you had the Boston Massacre. And then, of course, right with the decision with tea, not only did you have the symbolic tax on the tea, but then you had the decision by the British administration to grant a monopoly to the East India Company, whereby only they could sell tea to us. And so then that led to the Boston Tea Party, right? Dumping 10,000 shillings worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. And at that point, right, British Parliament, as well as the King George III, decide to make a statement with the the New England colonies. They shut down the New England town hall meetings. They shut down the colonial assembly. So now, right, technically, the people of Massachusetts have no political voice. They put in General Gage as a military governor over them who could declare martial law, shoot them on the spot, right? So the British are not messing around. They are cracking down with their famous coercive acts over Massachusetts. And instead of trying to succeeding and instilling fear into the rest of the colonies, there had already been a measure taken in Virginia and Massachusetts, whereby their assemblymen tried to, like with the Stamp Act Congress, right, where and their committees of correspondence, whereby they made a decision to try to have these committees and this regular correspondence that would morph into the First Continental Congress, whereby they should have leaders elected that united all of the colonies. That when one colony was in trouble and had its rights infringed upon, the rest of them would have that colony's back, right? And they were ordered not to do this. In one case, it was a vote, a famous vote of 92-17, I believe, in Massachusetts. And they were ordered by their governor renege on that decision to unite. And they decided in favor 92-17 to keep that decision. And so the governor said, fine, you as a colonial assembly no longer exist. And so that colonial assembly, right, met literally in taverns in extra legal fashion and continued to still be the voice of the Massachusetts people. So now you're getting ultimatums from the colonial governors. 9 out of 13 colonies were royal, right? Handpicked governors by the crown. They were given ultimatums to their assemblies, and one by one, the assemblies were taking their stand, saying, no, we're standing with Massachusetts and these other colonies. And so hence they were seen to no longer exist in the British eyes. Now there can no longer be symbiosis. There can't be cooperation because now the assemblies literally are outlawed and they're existing extra legally outside the English legal system. So at that point, you could say the writing's on the wall. It's almost inevitable that there's going to be conflict. And then philosophically, right? When our assemblies and our voices, our spokesmen, right, like Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin and others, contended that we are to be um, practically and actually represented as opposed to virtually represented by Parliament. People back in Parliament were making the argument, and royal governors were making the argument that there's no middle ground. It's one or the other. Either you're virtually represented by Parliament or you're actually represented by your colonial assemblies, and Parliament has no hold over you. And hence, you're declaring yourselves to be independent virtually. And so, some people contend at this point, by the early 1770s, the writing was on the wall with the coercive acts, etc. That conflict and declaring independence was almost inevitable, right? And then ultimately, in April of 1775, as General Gage and others heard that the different towns, because right people in the colonial militias had to make a decision to stay loyal to their governor or loyal to their rebel assemblies, and those who were declaring loyalty to their rebel assemblies were boasting that they were ready at a minute's notice, right, to stand up for their people's rights. So hence Minutemen, and they were known as like right these extra legal rebellious militiamen. Well, Minutemen were gathering, they were training, they were trying to gain resources, guns, and ammunition. And so word spread, and so the British troops tried to go to Concord, Massachusetts, to capture a cache of weapons, and also John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were known to be rabble rousers, right, to have them arrested. And on their way there, they met at the famous Lexington Green, and the Minutemen refused to disband. No one to this day knows who fired the first shot, but shots were fired, and a handful of colonial Minutemen were killed. And they went to Concord. They barely missed Hancock and Samuel Adams from arresting them. They captured what cache of weapons could be found. And on the British soldiers' way back to Boston, the American Minutemen began sniping them from behind trees and rocks and attacking them indirectly, and killing well over hundreds of them on their way back to Boston. And by that time, the writing was on the wall. The Continental Congress united and gave one last olive branch petition to George III, blaming everything on Parliament, asking him to disband his new cabinet and create a new one that was more Whig oriented and sympathetic to the plight of the English colonists here. And of course, he said no to the olive branch petition. And from there, right, we know the famous case by the next July, we had already formally declared independence. All right, so are there any questions?
I do. I got a kind of like a statement question. So as the late 1770s progressed, were the colonies compelled to entice soldiers with anything, like with land or
Oh,
money
that's a
or?
great question. When you look at Howard Zinn's book, he gets into that, right? And that's what he contends is to him, right? The fact that these rebel leaders of the Continental Army, first of all, they're going to have friction with the militia and the Minutemen, right? Because the Minutemen, they were adhering to the rhetoric from the Scottish liberal Enlightenment, saying, right, that any standing armies are inherently bad, are inimical to your freedoms, that the army should be decentralized. It should be democratically organized at the village and town level. And people should democratically elect their own officers and fight of their own free will and not be put under some central despotic military government, right? So, on principle, a lot of different militias refused to fight under this new Continental Army of George Washington's, right? And then, in addition to that, um, you had problems because they needed, claims historian Howard Zinn, a carrot and a stick. They needed some form of almost threatening them to fall into line with this rebellion and fear of consequences if they didn't join the rebellion. And they needed a carrot some type of inducements. Why should I risk my life fighting against the number one armed forces of the world, Great Britain's, right? So, absolutely, according to Howard Zinn, time and again, the Continental Army and state assemblies stepped up what they promised their soldiers if they were to fight for the rebellion, especially right when the war went poorly. When you look at the initial stages of 1776 and 1777, we arguably were getting our butts kicked, especially in New York, um, in the middle colonies. And so, when things were going awry and we were losing, morale went down, and there were a lot of desertions. People going back to their farms during harvest time to check on their families, for various reasons, deserting the army. And so the army, the Continental Army, the colonial militias, they began stepping up their inducements as far as land they were promising people for fighting, as far as these kind of bond certificates that they were telling them, right, that they would pay them back kind of as IOUs, as if they had lent money to their colonial assemblies and would get that money back with interest. Um, so, absolutely, to Howard Zinn, he sees that as evidence, right, that the average American colonist did not see this initially as their fight, as they saw it as these demagogue assemblymen who had their own agendas, wanted to kick the British out, and wanted to manipulate the common people to fight with and for them, and were hence became increasingly desperate to try to bribe them or coerce them, right, into fighting. And so you had a famous case of George Washington at Brooklyn Heights. He was humiliated by Howe's army in New York, and he put a young guy, Nathaniel Greene, in charge of a regiment, and they disobeyed him. And one of the men fired an old Spanish harquebus pistol at Nathaniel Greene's face, and thankfully it misfired and didn't kill him. Well, he gets the men back together, and he finds this guy and puts a gun to his head and threatened to kill him in front of all the army. And then Nathaniel Greene pleads for his life, says it's okay, I forgive him. He won't do it again, basically, right? The lesson has been learned. And Washington throws him to the ground and says, very well, but the next time there'll be no mercy. And he jumps on his horse and rides off. And so he, at times, played the bad guy, Washington, right? In enforcing curfews, publicly punishing people before all the other men. In one famous mutiny case, he had the loyal leaders of the militia fire upon and execute their own men that engaged in a mutiny. And the story goes that some of them were literally weeping as they were shooting their men, that they were forced to do such by Washington. And so at times, right, the rebel forces became coercive, and not to mention in the midst of their guerrilla warfare, this little warfare, right? That's not just refusing to take on the British soldiers in their strength of their numbers on standard, battlefield tactics, taking them one on one, right, toe to toe, if you will. That also entailed hitting their supply lines, hitting them while they were asleep, but also those who were Tories and were staying loyal to England and accommodating their soldiers and helping them with supplies. The rebel army and militias, they punished them. They burnt their fields to the ground. They confiscated their stuff. In some cases, of course, severe cases, they even engaged in violent acts against them. So, yeah, it's a
Got it.
fascinating topic.
Yeah. It just seems like, because the more you keep talking about Washington, that it just seems like he was like a strategist.
No, absolutely. A lot of people contend, right, that that time and time again, as far as the actual battle strategies and getting outflanked like he did at Brooklyn Heights, that he wasn't the most brilliant strategist, um, even that we had, much less against some of the British soldiers. But that he was pretty clever as far as what motivated our men and what kept them motivated, etc. Right?
Right.
And
Interesting.
then you have the famous case in the narrative of contingencies, the what ifs, is the British had certain opportunities that they did not take advantage of. Like I said, Howe, HOWE, and his army in New York, He had on 2 different occasions, he literally let Washington and the Army slip away in the middle of the night under fog when he had them cornered on Manhattan and Long Island. Um, Cases with Johnny Burgoyne coming from Canada, trying to encircle the New England colonies. Um, he is going to make an enemy of a guy named Clinton, and Clinton refuses to come help him out. Um, he uh, was supposed to get the help of Howe, and Howe stayed in Philadelphia instead. And he gets instead cornered at Saratoga outside of New York and surrenders a large British army. And then when he surrenders there at Saratoga, that supposedly convinces Louis XVI of France that we're not fighting a losing cause, that we have a fighting chance, and hence he's willing to sign an alliance to help our rebellion. And so just all these what ifs play into the fighting itself. It's just fascinating. All right. So are there any questions about the assignment or the topic? Are you sure? I've monopolized the conversation long enough. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd love to hear. Do you guys feel like you have a decent command over this to do this assignment pretty well? Any thumbs up or anything from anybody? You guys feel okay still there? All right. So that's it, you guys. I hope you feel like you've gained enough context to this to be able to do this this fifth assignment well. All right, so I have your names and you'll get your extra credit. Thank you for attending, you guys. Yes.
Wednesday, are you going over, what are we going over on Wednesday? Because I might not be able to make it on Wednesday.
I know that's a good question. Looking at this, right? So we have Independence is actually due Wednesday. Well, actually, the following Monday we'll have the Articles of Confederation. It's also called Drifting Toward a Republic, right? Because we tried a relatively democratic confederation before the republic that we have now, and obviously it failed, having a different government now. We're going to go over that, and I think it just entails 2 numbers,
Okay.
2 argumentative sections. So we'll go over that on Monday. Or
Okay,
sorry, on Wednesday.
So everything that was just talked about today is due Wednesday?
Is due Wednesday night. That's right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So thank you guys. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thank you, you guys. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mr. Conwell, I just had a quick question.
Yes.
On whether we would have multiple attempts on the next unit tests or not.
That's a good question. You know what? Normally, to be honest, hon, I only allow multiple attempts on the first 3 of the 6 quizzes and the first 1 of 3 tests.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So yeah, because I mean, when you think about it, right? The second and third tests, they're just 2 50-point assignments out of about 16. You have 13 or 14 assignments, and then you have your 3 tests, all worth 50 points apiece. So try not to stress too much, okay, hon? And also, we'll do a Zoom meeting whereby I'll go through the test as well.
Thank you.
But yeah, but most of the time, barring an exception, yeah, test 2 and 3, I just give you 1 shot at them, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. All right, you guys, have a good week, okay? Thank you.